Hello, everyone. My name is Alexandra Vacroux. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And it is a great pleasure for me to be hosting Anne Bobroff-Hajal and presenting her art and her understanding of Russian history in our talk on the painting playground of the Autocrats. Anne has a PhD in Russian history from the University of Michigan and is the author of the scholarly volume, what we call a book, Working Women in Russia Under the Hunger Tsars. Her extensively researched polyptychs, some of which we're going to see today, are satirical commentaries on how Russia's ruling elites have historically taken advantage of their unique geographic situation to amass and maintain power. Her work has been widely exhibited, including at Columbia University's Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and most recently at the Museum of Russian Icons in Clinton, Massachusetts. And I understand that it's possible to see that exhibition online, and we will be including a link to that in the chat. So Anne is going to start. Welcome, Anne, to the Davis Center.
Thank you so much.
And after her presentation, we will open the floor to Q&As, and I'll have some cues as well. So let me turn it over to you, Anne.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. And also thank you, Chris Martin, and everyone at the Davis Center, and everybody who is attending. I'm really excited to be here today. So I am going to share my screen and show you a lot of pictures. Sorry, I'm a little slow with this.
That's okay. We can see the slide. There you go.
Okay, perfect. Great, perfect. Okay, so for many years, I pursued a fusion of my two passions, Russian history and making art. Today, I'll talk about why I feel art provides powerful tools to interact with history and how complex historical analysis of individuals, societies, and geography provides a springboard for art that can integrate the full range of human experience, from tragedy to terror and serious analysis, through joy, political satire, whimsy, humor. So I'm going to start by describing the area of history I focus on in my art, and then I'll weave in the specific artistic techniques I use to tell my stories visually. I'm fascinated by the centuries-long web of connections among everyday Russians of all classes, living on the very unusual Russian landscape, the largest flat plain on Earth, and the autocratic governments that from the rise of Muscovy until today have reemerged even after they appeared to fall apart, as in the 17th century time of troubles, the 1917 revolution, the 1990 collapse of the USSR. So this is my most recently completed largest artwork, a 14-foot long polyptych called Darling Godsonny, Ivan the Terrible Advises the Infant Stalin. A polyptych is a multi-paneled artwork of any number of pieces. I create polyptychs because my art is very influenced by animation and its storyboards, and their similarities to icons, political cartoons, graphic novels, even comic books, all of which tell stories in sequences of pictures and words. Each of my polyptychs is narrated in song by one or more of the Infant Stalin's flying godparents. So this one is Tsar Ivan IV, called the Terrible, although he was really no more terrible than Europeans at the time. And this is the swaddled, mustached Infant Stalin looking at him adoringly. And then this is the type of speech bubble that I use throughout. This one has Ivan's music and the original lyrics I wrote for him. And then here are all my flying godparents together. Peter the Great here, Ivan IV, the Terrible, and Catherine the Great. And they bless the future autocrat Stalin with the wisdom of their earlier autocratic solutions to challenges Stalin will also face. So this is the first much smaller polyptych I ever created about Russia. It's called The Most Exposed Terrain on Earth. The individual people who I painted in this small triptych are only about an inch or so high. I used a magnifying glass and tiny brushes to paint each one as an individual portrait. There are never duplicates among my Russians. My goal with my art, and please keep focusing on this one desperate woman with her children as I zoom out on this painting. My goal is to reveal webs of connection I perceive between individual people's lives, such as this woman, and here she is still as I'm zooming out, her webs of connection with the other people in her everyday world, and her autocratic government, which I painted here as a satirical figure, and the geography on which they live. So now we've zoomed all the way out to reveal the flat Russian landscape, and this is the woman still in the midst of all of it. Because of Russia's endless flatness, unique in all the world, and its lack of natural protective barriers, like mountains or oceans. The United States has these huge oceans. Europe also has mountains. Russia has very little of either, and with very powerful enemies on either side. Many geographers have called Russia the hardest country on earth to defend. Well, so what? Who cares about defense? I think this woman cared. She had no idea Russia's geography was unique in the world, but she did know that almost every year, invaders or Tatar raiders stormed, often hundreds of miles across the steppe, burning villages, looting, and kidnapping people. Russian historian Peter Brown estimated that in the 8 centuries prior to 1800, 20 million Slavs were abducted from their homes and marched in chains south across the steppes to the Crimean slave markets. For centuries, slaves in Europe and later the Ottoman Empire were Slavs. Because of this, our word slave, the Spanish esclavo, and the French esclave derive from Slav. I think that constant yearly danger shaped this woman's attitude toward the Russian autocrat. But if I'm interested in Russian autocracy and geography and history, why do I express myself through art? I would say that I use art as a seduction, a way of enticing viewers of all ages, and this is one of my youngest viewers, and education into looking at the astonishing and moving tapestry of linkages among Russians, their society, and their landscape. These events and connections can be incredibly intense emotionally. And emotion is one thing art can bring to our understanding of why huge historical events happen. I feel that trying to understand the causes of horrifying events is the scaffolding of my art, providing the depth of tragedy and rich darkness, my art's iron framework. Then around that scaffolding, I can interweave all the pleasurable elements of art, color, beauty, silliness, such as my zany flying Godparents and the Infant Stalin. I think these silly or beautiful elements can also make us feel safer looking at horrific images because they remind us of the joyous elements of life. We can shift back and forth between terror and levity within the same work of art. So how do I try to movingly portray historical connections among individual Russians and their autocratic government? As one example, let's look at another woman from that small triptych. This woman isn't a peasant. She's a noblewoman holding her injured or dead child, also menaced by the same invaders or raiders the peasant woman was. A wider view shows you that rich and poor are all fleeing together to reach shelter. Zooming back in a bit, you see all these frantic people, peasants and nobility alike, running to safety inside the protection of the Russian autocracy. So Russia's lack of natural barriers against powerful enemies endangered Russians from the Tsar down through princes and the nobility of every level to the lowliest serf. Russia's vulnerability to raiders and invaders was a powerful pressure, I think, toward unity among all Russians under the autocracy's protection. For those of you who have always lived in safe environments, I hope my paintings help you in yourself and how you would feel if you lived with the possibility every year of your village or your town being razed to the ground and you or your family kidnapped with no way of escaping. You might feel terrorized enough to run under the protection of a militarily effective autocrat too. As an artist, when I'm painting these scenes, I don't want a studio model posing in self-conscious reenactments of intense moments. I want real people in this real situation. So I created huge image banks of photos of parents and children under attack that I used as references while painting. This is a very old image bank, so I can't separate out the individual photos anymore. But I wanted to show you some different pictures that I used for painting the peasant mother and the noble mother. So this man down here on the left, I found his face and his body language incredibly moving. And so I used that for my peasant woman over here. And then her son clinging to her, I used as my model, this boy clinging to his father as they're both under fire. And this photograph became the basis for my noble woman. So now I'll turn to my most recent completed polyptych, the 14-foot long one of Tsar Ivan's advice to the infant Stalin. This is a photo from the recent Museum of Russian Icons exhibit of my art. These are a couple of details from that polyptych to show you the complexity of my work. Again, I used a magnifying glass and tiny brushes to paint each 3-inch high person. So I had graduated from 1-inch high people to 3-inch high people as an individual portrait. It's very important to me to always maintain each person's individuality while at the same time portraying the huge social forces that impact their attitudes and lives. This polyptych portrays a different set of relationships among the players we've talked about. This one is about family patronage clans among the Russian nobility, and zooming out, their autocratic rulers, competing clans, and the peasants on whose work everything else depended. From the time of the rise of Muscovy, the Russian nobility was made up of family patronage clans. This is the yellow clan, as I painted it, in which powerful clan members at the top, and here I've taken a few out and enlarged them over here. So these powerful ones at the top were raised up and supported in power by their less mighty relatives at the bottom. And I've also enlarged a few of the very bottom ones. I painted the top nobles of every clan, rocketing themselves upward to yank the bottom of the Tsar's robe, competing for patronage to pass down to their lower relatives to maintain their loyal support. The first 2 panels of the 5 in this polyptych portray the startling similarities between Tsarist clans and Bolshevik clans after the 1917 revolution. We don't have time to go into those parallels today, so let's go back to some of the lowliest level blue clan members under Tsar Ivan. Notice the effort everyone is putting into this entire operation. Everyone in the clan wins out when their top relatives win patronage in Moscow to pass back down. Some of the lowest level, oh yes, okay. Yeah, got that. Okay, so while patronage clan members supported each other within the clan, they constantly battled rival clans for power. I seem to have lost, oh, there's my missing slide. Okay. As an expression of the intensity of these rivalries, I painted clans physically fighting each other, punching and kicking contenders from other clans out of the way. A few fall off the pyramid because the fighting gets so vicious. In fact, each real noble clan in history endlessly fought other clans with perpetual scheming, constant lawsuits, and sometimes actual brawling. I capture each person I paint in mid-fall or mid-tackle or at the apex of a kick. No artist model can replicate such peak moments when posing because they'd fall on the floor or over a cliff. Such acute positions can't be held for longer than a split second. So again, I created huge image banks of hundreds of photos, in this case of people intensely doing activities that use similar body movements to what I want my paintings to express. This sliding soccer player in this photograph on the left became a blue clan member in my painting who's lost his footing. And you can see the same exact position of the hand. I've really drawn on this, the flailing arm and back of him and the two legs that have slipped out from under him. And then on the right side over here, this wonderful twisting kick I used for my red clan member kicker. Okay. This process of searching and brainstorming about what types of human activities involve the action I want takes weeks or months of work. Here are a few more examples. The arrows here show various football players who I used as models for top boyars. For example, I used these two football players over on the left to paint this red clan woman up here tackling her blue clan competitor. I combined these two tackling images to create this sort of double maneuver of 4 yellow and green tacklers. I had originally collected a lot of photos of basketball players for these central people here, thinking their leaping up to dunk a basketball would make my best models for these boyars in the center, jumping up to grab the Tsar's robe. But I found that basketball players' legs are often straight when they're jumping up to the basket, a much less interesting body position for an artist than football players, whose knees are often bent as they jump for a ball. For brawls and fights, I had assumed boxers would be the logical models, but it turned out that visually the most vicious fights in sports are hockey players because they don't fight by any sports rules. So I used these two hockey players here for these two brawlers in the back, and I enlarged them a little bit so you can see them more clearly back here. So how do I get from the individual portraits to this large crowd scene of about 200 people? As models for this painting, I originally began by looking for acrobats forming human pyramids. I used a few of these photos as references throughout my painting, but on the whole, they were too skimpy. There's too much space between the people. Look at all of these people. They have too much space between them. To convey the solidity of clan bases. So then I had the idea of looking for kids creating human pyramids, either for fun or as for cheerleading. These human pyramids were a big move in the right direction for me because they're so close together, unlike the acrobats. Eventually, those human pyramids of kids became my super strong low-level foundations for each clan. But that was still far in the future, back when I was messily experimenting, and I hesitate to show you this slide, but I was messily experimenting with collaging together many different photos to form a huge hierarchy of clans. Even though I was moving in the right direction with the kids' pyramids, the process continued to be extremely messy for weeks, involving endless trial and error, collaging together images that might or might not work. I also do a huge amount of research on clothing of each time period, using as many images as I could find, or drawing on experts like Arch Getty, who helped me a lot with the post-revolutionary Bolshevik clans. So anyway, this is a page about from a book about my art with a few of my clothing research images. So now I'll talk a bit about how I begin work on each of my polyptychs. Each one is organized around what that polyptych's flying godparent is singing to the infant Stalin, or actually in this case, it's two godparents. This is Ivan and Peter the Great. So the first step of creating each piece is to perfect the original lyrics I write to the tune of Kalinka. That godparent's advice makes up the story of all the panels in sequence. I've been asked whether I sketch out each entire polyptych before I start painting. I never sketch the entire polyptych fully before starting to paint, but I do excruciatingly detailed sketches for each panel, a black and white line drawing sketch that I transfer to the canvas. While painting that panel, I often have only a very sketchy overall sense of what the rest of the panels will include. I've also been asked about the way I collage digital images into my art. In this painting of Stalin's Far East labor camps, for example, I collaged in actual rare photographs of the camps. Here's one, some other ones. These images are very low resolution and not super clear, but I wanted to include them to honor the memory of the millions of people who died in these camps. I also often collage digital images of my own paintings, which I call pre-paintings, into my art and then paint over them again. I do pre-paintings for different reasons, most often because I want to be able to paint tiny people in more detail than is possible to fit in the final polyptych. I don't do this in every painting. All the Russians that we've looked at so far, I painted directly on the final canvas. But here's an example of when I did use pre-paintings in my Catherine triptych. Notice these two circular side pieces. I originally painted these two scenes in a larger size as a diptych, showing the continuity between serfdom during the Tsarist period and collective farms as they developed under Stalin. Then I reduced digital photographs of the large paintings and collaged them into the final triptych. So you see those on the sides here. So last, I will turn to the newest polyptych that I'm working on now, and it's far from finished. So again, please forgive the mess here. But so this one is Peter the Great singing to the infant Stalin about his passion for sailing ships and warm water ports. I'm using pre-painting extensively here because the center panels of this polyptych will be an 8-foot wide map of the entire world in Peter's time. Each continent will be filled with scenes that provide the context of what was going on in the rest of the world leading up to and through Peter's reign, and why he was so desperate for a warm water port. The Museum of Russian Icons exhibited this as a polyptych in progress, together with some of its pre-paintings. And again, the piece is far from finished, but it showed how I use this pre-painting technique. This over here is my pre-painting of the Americas, which you can see is larger than the eventual map will be. This photo shows more of the pre-paintings over on this side. So this is a detail of my pre-painting of part of South America, showing Europeans' capacity to force labor from native populations and from Blacks kidnapped in Africa and brought to the so-called New World as slaves. This detail of the Spanish conquistadors shows what I meant when I said that Europeans were just as terrible as Ivan the Terrible in these centuries. I'm doing a lot of pre-paintings for this world map because even at 8 feet wide, the continents are too small for me to paint all the scenes of tiny people well. I can create a more finely detailed map in the end by painting each scene much larger, then reducing it to fit into the world map. So this is a mock-up of only a small section of the final map, but you can see, I wanted to show you this for Europe's many warm water ports, and these are very low resolution here because it's only a mock-up. Europe is a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by coastlines with many naturally protected ports. And notice the gold and silver streaming across the Atlantic Ocean aboard European ships sailing back to their warm water ports in Europe. This stolen wealth is likely what fueled the rise of capitalism. What Peter could see warm water ports giving Europe from 1492 on was the capacity to expropriate labor, gold, silver, and other valuables to vastly enrich all of Western Europe beyond anything known before. With only a port on the Arctic Ocean, Peter must have felt Russia was missing out big time. Even after St. Petersburg was constructed, building up the infrastructure to move goods and people from the Russian hinterland to Peter's new port took far longer than the end of his reign. So I'm going to end here with the last pre-painting of Stalin that I've used in a couple of different polyptychs. And I hope this is giving you a sense of my art, and I look forward to hearing what each of you may have noticed in my images or in my approach to art. Thanks, that's it.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was spectacular. And I really encourage everyone, when you have the opportunity, and hopefully we'll create that kind of opportunity eventually at the Davis Center, to come back to our offices and look at these pictures in person and really appreciate the incredible detail that Anne has packed into each of the murals and each of the elements of the polyptychs. And before I ask questions about your technique and maybe about the historical questions, I wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more, Anne, about how you came to this form of expression. You were trained as a historian, but obviously you found that you needed more than words to express your understanding of Russian history. And could you tell us a little bit about how you came to this really unique way of expressing Russian history?
Well, I was brought up to be an artist, and I always wanted to be an artist. And I had a father who was very supportive of me being an artist. And I just always thought that's what I would be. And then when I was in college, Gerda Lerner, who I don't know if people still know of her, but she was like the grandmother of women's history. She was just a wonderful woman. And she told me that I was really good at historical research, and I should go to graduate school in history. And nobody had ever told me before that I could do anything besides art. So I decided to do that out of the blue. And so I went through, and I kept having a lot of doubts about what I was doing the whole time. But anyway, I got the PhD and eventually the book was published. But I never got over that feeling that I should be somehow combining these two things. And I, really struggled a lot for a long time with what medium would be best to, and that was actually how I originally got involved in animation, and I was doing screenwriting and, a few other things along the way. So anyway, that's how it slowly evolved.
So one of the interesting things you mentioned was that that you see art as kind of a seduction to pull people into a Russian history they might not be attracted to in the first place, and that the ability to trigger emotion is what then renders the history kind of viscerally interesting. So is that also one of the things that drove you to combine these things, that you have a passion for Russian history, you have a passion for art, and how is it that you can transmit that passion to an audience?
Yeah, I mean, I guess so. It's funny because I really feel like my native language is art. And so if I want to express something, that's ultimately how I just do that. And it's sort of hard. I often find it difficult to even think about what my artistic process is because it's so intuitive to me. I just do things and in art. And when people ask me what my artistic process is, I don't know. I have to think about this and try to remember what I do. So yeah, and I'm sure that emotional thing that you can get through art is very much a part of why I wanted to get back to doing art.
So there,
yeah.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, with these scenes that I was showing you from, the two mothers with their children in the beginning of the talk, I really feel like emotion is one of the elements of what causes us to do what we do, including what causes masses of people to do what they do. And if you can understand what it is in a situation that causes people to have masses of people to fear, to be fearful, then you can get a better understanding of why certain historical developments are happening. Why is there an autocracy that keeps returning in Russia? No matter what, it always seems to come back. And I think, a lot of it is that open landscape that the autocracy has always defended the Russian people against that openness.
So there are a few questions about your artistic process, and I don't know if it's the kind of thing that you can articulate or if it's also intuitive. But there are questions about how you choose the color palettes, for example, with the clans that are in different shades, different colors, and also whether your use of words, for example, with the songs at the top, if that has to do with kind of trying to integrate the historian's training into the art itself. Like, how do you pull these different elements together?
Well, let's see. So the color palette, I tend to like bright colors, I guess, and I needed a way. It's so interesting. The usual way that people show social classes is with horizontal layers of people who have different functions in a society. But the more research I did, the more I realized that for Russia, that horizontal thing doesn't really describe the social structure. It really is these vertical patronage clans. So to differentiate, I mean, I was trying to think, how can I show these separate clans? And then I thought about color. And so this is why I made the blue clan, the red clan, the green clan, and the yellow clan. And then let's see, what was the other question?
About the words.
About the words, yeah. I mean, I'm not a very musical person, but I grew up in a house of musical people. And the way I find that I can get into music is through lyrics. And I love the idea of inventing silly lyrics to go along with a musical tune that I would have no idea of how to write. So I chose the most commonly known folk tune in Russia that might be known to a lot of people in the United States, Kalinka, I mean, it's ubiquitous. And so I was just setting these kind of silly lyrics. I mean, the lyrics are satirical. I don't know how much I talked about the satirical element if that came through today, but there really is a satirical thing where I'm making fun of these czars and how they're taking advantage of this need for defense by the Russian people. I'm trying to remember what the term is. It's like a protection racket.
Mm-hmm.
Historian at one point who used that term, and I thought that was great. This is a big protection racket, and I'm making fun of it. And so I'm not sure that I think the lyrics actually come from sort of farther back in my childhood, and that I like being able to set my own lyrics to music. Although I'm sure the historians thing gets in there too.
So you did mention when you were talking, I think it was when you were showing the Far East and the labor camps.
Yes.
That there's this tension between showing terrible things, right?
Yeah.
And having a sense of humor, right? And having the satire.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you kind of balance those two sentiments, right? Which are, that's life, right? And so
right.
It is a balance, but do you find it difficult, like, oh, now I'm I'm making it Stalin too funny, and in fact he was a terrible person, right? How do you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I do worry about that at different times. And at the same time, I think, I'm, as an artist, I think I'm somebody who spends a huge amount of time alone. I like just being in my little studio without too much outside world. And I think what that tends to generate is a feeling on my part that I want to include all of life in my art, because this is sort of my companion, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's, I want to include all of these different parts of life. And there is a balancing act. I mean, I worry sometimes that people will think I'm making fun of something that I really don't mean to, or that I'm getting too serious and too boring. There's, mm-hmm. I mean, there is that tension. Yeah.
I guess that's why you have to watch a lot of sports, right? Especially the brutal ones to find images, right? You said hockey, football, soccer, right?
Right.
So one question which is related to this, which is how do you integrate gender questions into your work, right? Because obviously there are a lot of women in different positions. The Klansmen are also Klanswomen. How do you think about that as you're putting together the paintings?
Well, it was really interesting because the first panel that I painted of the clans under Ivan, I included a lot of women because that's my nature, and also because those were family clans. So women did have a big role to play there. And then, I started in on the second panel, which was the Bolshevik time period. And I actually, when I got into doing this whole huge polyptych, I didn't even know that I was going to end up doing clans repeatedly. I didn't know that there were clans that resurfaced after the Bolshevik Revolution. And I actually began to I did a huge amount of historical research about that, and I could get glimpses that there were clans among the Bolsheviks, but I was just really struggling because you have to know a lot to be able to know how to paint something. You can't just sort of have a vague idea. So you have to really know the stuff. So I was, kept searching and searching and searching to find out what were these clans like? How can you paint them and then boom, I suddenly found, after I had done like 6 months of research, I found that Arch Getty was about to publish this huge volume on the Bolshevik clans, and I couldn't believe it. And I got in touch with him, and he became a huge source for me. I mean, just a huge source. And I kept saying to Arch, Arch, aren't there some women in there? Can't I put some women in there? Come on, I had all these women in the first panel. And he kept saying, it won't be accurate. And but I could put in a few women, but it won't be accurate. So that's, it's hard because then you're sort of stuck with this uneven thing. Yeah, but there are, certainly a lot of women among the peasants who form the bottom of that whole thing.
And so in terms of the research that you do, right, obviously, secondary sources are very important, but do you go to the archives sometimes? Where do you kind of, when you want to do research sort of on the Russian history that's going to inform one of your paintings, where do you go looking for information and details?
Well, I would say this is the one big difference, I would say, between my research and a real historian's, research, is that I no longer look at primary sources. I mean, that was, the big thing when I was doing my PhD work, and I love looking at original sources, but it's not something that I can really, have time to do now with all this painting, which also takes a lot of time. So I love the detective work of trying to, really search down all kinds of, secondary sources, articles and books. When I was starting to do this, I didn't have access to an academic library, which back before the internet you needed to have. And I was no longer at a university. So my daughter was in graduate school at Penn State. And so I used to drive her out to Penn State and get to the library to use the books there. She would always send me articles. I could get articles through her, but I couldn't get to the books without actually going there. So I did that. But it was, I don't know, it's cool. I really love the historical research.
And what about, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just that's my regret about having left the field of history is not doing that anymore.
But you must spend quite a lot of time with icons, right? Both in terms of the inspiration for some of the work, for the writing, and also the animation element of it. Or have you kind of internalized so much of it already?
I think that I don't, spend that much. Actually, the important part of the icon that I do a lot of work with in the beginning of a polyptych is the outside shape of it, because I need that thing at the top, whatever. Let's see, I just learned at the Museum of Russian Icons, the word, I think it's a crest, is the shape at the top, I think is called a crest. And I need a shape that's going to work for what I want to put inside that boundary, and that also captures the feeling of the overall message that I'm trying to, convey. And so I do a tremendous amount of work in the beginning with the outside shape, and I have to say, I would say that it's much more visual research than I wouldn't say that I am very knowledgeable about icons. And I being exhibited at the Museum of Russian Icons, I mean, it's amazing. People should go out there to see just that, the icons, or that at that museum. I think it's the largest collection of icons in North America, or outside of Russia, or whatever it is, and they are just breathtaking. So and the people there are extremely knowledgeable about icons, and you can really pick their brains. So I highly recommend it.
I have to say also that about that museum, right? It is definitely worth a visit, even though
Yeah.
it's, a little bit of a drive outside of
Right.
Boston. But, I am not very into religious art, but that museum is just fascinating, right?
Yeah.
It's not fascinating because it's religious art, although, people who are
Yeah.
into that will appreciate it. But the diversity of imagery, of colors, of shapes, the
Yeah.
way that they're put together in the different parts of the museum,
Yes.
it's really inspiring for anyone who likes visual stimulation, right, of a complex kind.
Yeah.
It's an incredible museum.
I'm glad to hear your reaction to it, because I wasn't sure whether I felt that way because of, my now connection to it, but I just find it, I mean, and like you, I'm not into religious imagery either. And so I really didn't, and I don't particularly, relate to the religious imagery and icons, but boy, when you go there and you see them in the flesh, it's really, really something. And I think you're right about the variety of shapes, and oh my God, just some of these, like three-dimensional things, and they're really fantastic.
So. That actually raises one of the questions from the audience is, how do we appreciate your art in a pandemic, right? Obviously, it's meant to be seen in person. We can see from the pictures you showed at the beginning that people like get up very close, like they're even touching it sometimes, which I'm sure is a little bit scary. But how can people appreciate your work? I know you've referred to a book, right? That had some of the. Maybe you could tell us sort of what are the different ways that people can enjoy your art when we can't see it in person.
Well, yeah, it's an online book, which is actually, it's not totally available right now, but yeah, that I think is a really, I mean, because that book really describes my process, and goes into great detail about the big, huge Ivan polyptych. So I think that's a lovely source, and I'm sort of working on trying to make it more available. Let's see. And then, oh yeah. And, there are a lot of pictures on my website that are pretty high resolution, which I've been told I should not put high resolution pictures on the website, but I do it anyway. And yeah, so, I mean, I guess that's sort of it at this point. And I should say that there is this virtual exhibit on the Museum of Russian Icons website. So I hope that maybe you will, put the link to that
in the listing. Yeah.
Yes, right.
So are you spending the pandemic creating art as opposed to kind of working about exhibitions? What are you doing now? What are you working on?
Well, I was really going crazy with this Peter, the new Peter one. I mean, it's just so really incredible to sort of try to branch out to the rest of the world. This is the first time I've done one that involves the entire world. And it's such a revelation to try to look at what was going on in the rest of the world at that time. I mean, because Peter was so, was so involved. I mean, he did this grand embassy through Europe, in which he spent, I've forgotten, a year or two wandering around Europe and trying to learn a lot of things. He was supposedly in disguise, but since he was 6'8" tall, he couldn't really be in disguise. And then he worked for a long time on the docks of the Dutch East India Company, which is exactly all the people who were, raping the rest of the world of their gold and resources and human beings. I mean, just, this terrible slavery that was going on. I mean, it's really such an interesting period. in so many ways. I mean, including that it was the beginning of that switch from slaves being, or this is my perception of it, and I could be a little off here, but that so many of the slaves prior to all of this were Slavs. I mean, I'm sure there were slaves in other parts of the world too, but in Europe and the Ottoman Empire, a lot of the slaves were Slavs. And then you have this big shift to when the Europeans are going out into the world and turning all the indigenous populations into slaves and taking Africans, kidnapping Africans and enslaving them all around the world. And then another thing that we don't really know, or that I didn't know, I wasn't that aware of it, is that there was a lot of slavery around the Indian Ocean too. But anyway, it's just this real big change in the world, I feel. And it's so interesting to set Peter the Great within that time, instead of just, I don't know, I've always in the past just seen him from the viewpoint of Russia, and that he, wanted these warm water ports and ships and everything. And then you can really see why that was so important.
So how long would it take you to do that big work, from the time you start conceptualizing it through the painting?
Well, the one on Ivan's, the big one that we've looked at, took 4 years. And it was, a lot of that was sort of getting stuck over that issue of how do I portray the social structure. And, every time I start one of these, I say, I am not going to take years to get this done. I'm going to do it, and do it faster. And it just doesn't happen. They always take a long time. I mean, let's see, I think I started the Peter one, maybe, I don't want to say this, 18 months or 2 years ago. I don't want to think back too much. And I at least this time I have much more of it clear in my mind. I've done a lot more of the work on the various panels around the map of the world. So I've really done a lot of preparatory work. So I'm hoping that one more year it will be done.
That long to me. I mean, when I see the detail in your 1 or 3 inch figure, and imagine how long it takes to do one of those.
Yes.
4 years seems to be pretty fast to have
right.
With thousands of people.
Right. Yeah.
So are you ever tempted to do something contemporary? I know that you're a historian, but when you talk of the kind of persistence of vertical relationships and hierarchies and clans, are you ever tempted to kind of cover a more modern period?
Well, I did include at the end of that big polyptych, I included a photograph of Putin with his top clan members. And then there was a point when I was in conversation, shall we say, with the Garage Museum in Moscow, which was funded by one of these people. So I quickly removed him from from my artwork there. And but I feel like I'm not really an expert in this more recent time period. So I don't know. I mean, I would really like to, but it takes time. And then the other thing is that I have also started working on a piece on the persistence of iterations of slavery in the United States, which, let's see, I've sort of set this aside for Peter the Great now, so I have to try to get my brain screwed back around to that. But I think, for example, that, and again, this is somewhat more historical, but I think we let the North off the hook far too much with slavery. And I don't mean just owning slaves. The Northern economy was so integrated with slave plantations in the South and in the Caribbean. I mean, all of these lovely New England farmers were growing food that got shipped down to, to slave plantations. The fishermen, all the cod fishermen, their rotten fish got shipped down to the slave plantations. The cotton that was grown on plantations in the United States became the fuel of industrialization in the North of all these factories, the spinning and weaving that began that. And the insurance industry in Hartford began by insuring slaves. So now I realize I'm still historical here, but what I'm really trying to do is sort of to bring this into the present day in the United States, because it is something, I mean, we have our continuities too. It isn't just Russia. We've had iterations of slavery ever since, we so-called abolished slavery, but then we had sharecropping, which is the same thing by another name or slightly different arrangement, and so on. Jim Crow, lynchings, and so on. So anyway.
So do you think will your next work focus on the US, do you think, after Peter?
I'm not sure, because I did get, I did a lot of work on that one. And I'm just not sure what I will, once Peter is done, where I'll go at that point. I'll have to see. Yeah.
So let me ask you as a last sort of closing question.
Yeah.
This way of visualizing history, right? Of kind of looking at it with images rather than, let's say, reading about it.
Yeah.
Are we learning different things than what we would learn when we're reading, or are we learning the same thing just in a different way?
Yeah, this is always this is a big question, I think. And I'm not totally sure, but I do think that visualizing things does give you certain types of insights that you wouldn't have otherwise. For example, with the clans, what they look like? Boy, those clans are basically a military hierarchy. That's what they are. They're, and so I saw that only toward the end of working on that whole polyptych. And so I think for me at least, I learned that. Or I started conceiving of sort of hypothesizing about that in a different way. And I think also, what we talked about before, that it brings emotion more easily, possibly, hopefully, into what people are, imbibing about history. So I think, I think that you can learn different things as well as the same things.
I was thinking about this when you were talking about how you had taken the pyramids, right? That you didn't want the acrobats, you wanted the high school students in the pyramids, because what you want to convey is sort of the proximity, right? That people are really crowded against each other. They're not sort of comfortably. And that's something that you can really convey with an image, right? Much more effectively than the 5 paragraphs it would take for you to explain that, right?
That's a great example. Yes. And that whole process. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anne. This has been delightful. I love your work, and it's wonderful to talk to you and to hear about the thought that goes into the work, and then to see it kind of expressed in terms of images. It's really been a delight, and I look forward to when we can invite you to show your work at the Davis Center and give us a lecture in person.
I would love to do that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It was our pleasure.